probably heard me say it, I think gardeners are the biggest optimists in the world because, you know, we're always looking to the future. When you buy that tomato plant out there, you're not thinking about that tomato plant this size. You're thinking about when it gets this big and has lots of fruit on it. When you plant that little bitty begonia or whatever, you're not looking at that. You're thinking about what it's going to be, you know, 3 months from now. When that orchid hybridizer plants that orchid seed, he damn well expects to live to see what his hybrid came out to be. There's an old fella passed away a few years ago up in upstate New York named Rodney Wilcox Jones. Rod was making orchid hybrids when he was past 100 years old.
Wow.
And fully expecting to live to see them flower. He made it to 108. Wow. He died of prostate cancer because he refused an operation because he was afraid to make him impotent at 106. But anyway, that's a whole different story, my hero. But I've known, and around this country, we have a number of the finer orchid hybridizers who are in their 80s and 90s. And I've always said that, you know, that's one reason they live so long is that they have got so much to look forward to because you go through all this effort. And orchid hybrids, I mean, especially the big, you know, colored corsage type orchids, you breed these things together and you never know what you're going to get. And in the orchid judging game, the plants that have extremely good color, extremely good shape, become fairly valuable. And you're growing out 1,000 seedlings of a given cross, and out of that, probably 5 of them are going to be really outstanding plants. Probably 50 of them are going to be really ugly plants that ought to be thrown away, and all the ones in the middle are probably things that you're going to see on the shelves of a nursery or wherever for sale. But you know what? The plant of a prize-winning flower looks just exactly like the plant of a really ugly flower. And so you don't know what it's going to be until it blooms for the first time. And so, anyway, that's one reason I think orchid hybridizing is so much fun and appeals to so many people. But let's think about it now. We've got a Rieger begonia that we grew from a cutting, came into flower, and was ready to be sold 14 weeks later, and it's going to sell for $10 or $12. You take an orchid plant that somebody's been growing for 4 years before it bloomed for the first time, you'd expect it to be a little bit more expensive. And I think that, you know, the fact that you can buy blooming orchids for $25 or $35 or so, I think they're a tremendous bargain. Sure, they cost 3 times as much as that begonia or that chrysanthemum did, but it took 30 times longer to grow them, and that's why they are a little bit more expensive. Now, if you get into growing orchids, you have a much, much greater opportunity than I did when I started growing these things in high school, because back then the only way to get a really good quality flower was to buy a whole bunch of little seedlings, let them grow out, and maybe 1 out of 1,000 turned out to be a really, really special flower. About 20 years ago, 25 years ago, they developed a technique for orchids that they call meristem tissue culture. And they can take, you know, a few years ago, this would have been an extraordinarily valuable plant because that's a pretty darn nice flower. And if you look at some of the ones inside, look at the colors and the shapes and the unusual qualities. I mean, those things are plants that would have been blue ribbon winners just a few years back. But they are able to take, and they actually take a little bud out from beneath one of these little bracts, one of these little coverings over the same thing that that whole plant grew from originally. But they take this bud out, and rather than put it on the solid nutrient mix, they clean it. And I mean, this thing is this size. It's you know, so small you can barely see it. But they put it into a liquid nutrient solution. And when you have a seed, you know, it's all developing, it's all starting from a single cell. What makes the plant decide this cell is going to become a root, this cell is going to become a leaf, this cell is going to be a shoot that grows upright? You know what the force is that makes that occur? It's gravity. And that's why the lower cells in a developing seed will tend to turn into roots. The upper cells, that's an oversimplification. But gravity is what makes these embryonic, undifferentiated cells decide whether they're going to be the stem that grows up or the root that goes down. So they take this little piece of tissue, they put it in a liquid broth, and they put it in this thing that looks like a big, I don't know what you call it, just I guess a vertical turntable. And it goes round and round and round, and you've got these little pieces of tissue in there, and they literally don't know which way is up. So what do? They just keep making more and more and more and more undifferentiated, embryonic stem cell, I guess you could call it, tissue. And what you end up is this big round green glob of cells that have just reproduced over and over and over and over and over without being allowed to decide whether they're going to be roots or stems or leaves or whatever else. Well, then once it gets to a certain size, they will take that bunch of tissue out, they'll chop it into little tiny pieces, and each piece is put on, again, you use that same bottle, you put about 30 little pieces of tissue in there, and now each one of those now knows which way is up and which way is down, and it turns into a whole plant. So what you can do is, instead of having this plant, and I guess given time, you know, in 10 years this plant might be big enough you could divide it and make 2 plants out of it or whatever, but instead of that we can now make 100,000 plants that are identical to this plant through the process we call tissue culture. So if you get into the orchid business today, you can buy the finest, you can buy a tissue culture of the finest orchids in the world. Plants that 35 years ago you might have paid $10,000 for. Today you'll buy the finest plant in the world for maybe $30 or $40, same price as you would for a seedling grown plant. When they first discovered tissue culture, they said, oh gee, nobody's going to grow anything from seed anymore, it'll all be just tissue culture of the really good plants. Well, what it turned out is that human nature, curiosity is a wonderful thing. And there are an awful lot of growers out there that said, what would I get if I crossed this plant with that plant? And growing plants from seed is alive and healthy today. And the bigger growers, the Matsuis of the world, Matsui is a big grower in California, their little orchid greenhouse range covers about 40 acres of orchids, and they're not one of the big guys. Some of them are even bigger than that. You go over to Holland in some places, there'll be greenhouses that cover 100 acres that are solid orchids. But they're growing out huge numbers of these plants and then selecting the best of the best for tissue culture. So you've got a great advantage. You can buy 20 plants and have 20 award-winning plants the day that you get them. So orchid growing has come really a long way. Bugs, problems with orchids, keep that rooting medium, potting medium in good shape and you will not have many problems. You occasionally will see scale on orchids. If so, neem is usually the product that will get it under control pretty quickly.
You spray the whole
Spray
thing?
wherever you see the scale. Thinner leaved orchids like the Paphiopedilums or some of the Dendrobiums, some of the Oncidiums that have thin leaves, these things may become susceptible to spider mites, but like other plants, spray them with that liquid seaweed every 2 or 3 weeks and you will never ever see a spider mite on an orchid. They're just tough, hardy plants, and they really get very few problems if you give them enough light and if you keep the roots in good shape. Now everybody says, what kind of pot should I put my orchids in? It makes no difference. The plants don't really care as long as they have good drainage. These were this is just a glazed version of what the original orchid pots look like. The original pots that everybody used for growing orchids were clay pots with many holes drilled in the side just to improve the air circulation. Problem was the roots grew out through these holes, and when they needed a bigger pot you had to smash the pot. I guess that was a pretty good ploy by the people that make the pots. But anyway, what they call orchid pots will have holes in the side. This is one of the original clay type orchid pots. See how the extra holes were cut in the bottom? When I was growing up we didn't have a lot of money. I couldn't afford to pay the extra money for these orchid pots, so I put a carbide blade on my saw. And I could take a clay pot and in just a few seconds I could cut 3 or 4 big slits in the side of the pot. And that's how my orchid collection originally started, was growing in homemade orchid pots. But we found that it's really not that important. Now again, see how this pot has the little slits cut in the side? That's not mandatory. You can grow orchids